Now, I'm hoping you've all got a copy of some notes that we sent through. The reason I did this is because I've got about 6.5 or 7 studies of Jonah, and we've got time for about 4. So that's some stuff I thought I couldn't really squeeze in to talk about. So I'll refer to those as we go. So there's some useful background and some material that goes with the studies, not all of which I can talk about in great detail. So Jonah's he's a tremendous book, and what I'm going to do this weekend, God willing, is we've got a bit of time tonight and then 3 full studies tomorrow and some time Sunday. So I'm going to start at 1 verse 1 in about 19 seconds, and I'm going to get to chapter 4 verse 11 tomorrow night, and I'll finish kind of at the right time. So I won't necessarily do 1 chapter per study, just because the time doesn't quite allow. But I promise to get through all 4 chapters before Sunday morning. Okay, 1 verse 1. It's an outrageous book, Jonah. He's an outrageous character. There are remarkable miracles. There are secret codes. There are types and shadows. There are patterns of all kinds. And 2 things above all happen in the book. This is only one of 2 things that the Jews read on the Day of Atonement. It's a book about the atonement. And 2 things happen in the book. There is a ruthless examination of the character of a servant of God. It's absolutely ruthless. By extension, the ruthlessness of that examination should apply to us. That's what God expects of his servants. The second thing is there is a glorious demonstration of the character of God, and therefore, as God's servants, what God would expect from us. And the clash between those 2, between the character of the man and of his God, is of course the story of the book of Jonah. And it is one man's argument with his God, which of course is writ large in our lives in small ways and in large. So those 2 key ideas, of course, are elements of the atonement. And the book covers sin, and it covers suffering, and it covers supplication, and it covers salvation, and it covers the cycle of the judges, and it does so in 4 chapters with the Ninevites and Jonah, and they're mirrors of each other. And it's really not a complicated story. I'm going to assume that you know the story well, you know what happens, and you know most of the major ideas, because I don't think it's complicated, and I think it's reasonably well known. So I've assumed, therefore, a few things. Over the weekend then, so we're going to talk about this in 5 sessions, including Sunday morning. What I want to start with is just this little bit here. Now, in your notes, there is a much more detailed structure of the book, which I've got chapter by chapter. So if nothing else, Jonah is just a story in 2 parts. Chapter 1 and chapter 2 is then repeated in chapter 3 and chapter 4. So it is the same story. What's different about chapter 3 and chapter 4 is that there's a little bit at the end, verse 10 and verse 11, which is the lesson for Jonah, but otherwise it's the same story. So what you can see in chapters 1 and 2, you should expect to see in chapters 3 and 4. So I won't go back to the structure again. That's in your notes also. But if you can just remember that it is just the same story twice, that's probably a good start for the structure of the book. And let's go from there. All right, ready? 1 verse 1. The word of Yahweh came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, so Jonah, the son of Amittai, lives in Galilee, about 3.5 miles northeast of Nazareth, in the town of Gath-Hepher, in the tribal area of Zebulun. So Jonah's a prophet, of course, as you know. And the word's already come to Jonah back in 2 Kings chapter 14. And that's also in your notes, and it's important background information. 2 Kings 14 verse 25. Because back there is where Jonah made his name as a prophet. Back there, Jonah's given a prophecy and he tells the people, this is what's going to happen to the land. It'll be great and it'll be broad and magnificent. And wondrous things will happen. We'll be prosperous and the land will expand when our borders will increase. And all of those things that Jonah prophesied in 2 Kings 14 verse 25 came to pass. And Jonah was famous as the prophet of prosperity, as a prophet of wealth, as a prophet of expansion. And it was a wondrous time for Jonah the prophet. Despite that, Israel was utterly idolatrous. And Jeroboam the king, although effective as a king, was utterly wicked. And with that background, and with the fame of Jonah the prophet, the word of Yahweh came to him. Verse 2, and said, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up before me. Now, of all the things that Jonah might have thought he'd ever hear from his God in heaven, I'm pretty sure they never thought he'd hear this. And I don't think this was a good day for Jonah. They were an inveterate enemy of the Jews. They hated the Jews, and the Jews hated them. And it seemed to Jonah, and in particular, this is verse 15 of your notes, by the way, it seemed to Jonah that the problem really is not Jonah's, but the problem is God's. God's being inconsistent. God's not requiring the same things of people, and God's not delivering the same things to people. So right from the very start of the book, Jonah has a disagreement with what God's doing and with what God's plan is. God promised Jonah that the land would expand in 2 Kings 14. And Jonah said that to the people. And Israel had expanded. But then God told Amos that Israel would suffer at the hand of the Assyrians. The very Assyrians, of course, that Jonah had to go and preach to right now. Well, that's difficult to understand, isn't it, if you're Jonah the prophet? Why would God do that? Why would you give with one hand and take away with the other? Why would I preach expansion and prosperity and all of these good things? You're then going to destroy it with the other hand and tell Amos that it's not like that at all. Verse 3. Consequently, therefore, Jonah rose to flee from the presence of Yahweh and went down to Joppa. And he found a ship going to Tarshish. He paid the fare and went down, and off he went to Tarshish from the presence of Yahweh. So we call it Jaffa today, Joppa. It's still a port on the coast of Israel for those of you who have been lucky enough to go there. And it's a significant place, of course, because in years to come, Peter would preach to the Gentiles in Acts chapter 10. He would have the vision of the unclean things in the sheet at Joppa. He'd be there with Simon the tanner, unclean, in Joppa. And that's the casting off place for Jonah as he seeks to escape preaching to the Gentiles. In chapter 2, if you just turn over the page, he'll quote Psalm 139. And chapter 2, of course, is Jonah's psalm. It's Jonah's psalm and then Jonah's exposition, if you like. And he'll quote Psalm 139, verse 7 to 10, and he'll say, Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend to heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and the right hand shall hold me. And Jonah quotes that in Jonah chapter 2. So when it says, therefore, in Jonah 1 that he fled from the presence of Yahweh, Jonah knows he can't escape God. He knows he can't literally escape the presence of God because it's impossible to do that. And he says that in Jonah chapter 2. If you go back to Genesis chapter 4, just briefly, Jonah knows what he's doing and he knows what he's saying. We're told this in Genesis chapter 4, verse 16. Genesis 4, verse 16. There's been an argument between two brothers, as you know. Verse 16, Cain went out from the presence of Yahweh and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain didn't think he was leaving the visible presence of God either. So put it this way, Jonah lives in Gath Hepher, in northern Israel. Joppa is the closest port to Jerusalem, which is where the temple was. and where Yahweh put his name, and where the presence of God dwelt. And in Jonah chapter 2 verse 4, Jonah refers to this because Jonah says in Jonah 2 verse 4, "Then I said, I am cast out of thy sight, yet I will look again toward thy holy temple." What Jonah's saying is that when Jonah fled from the presence of God, Jonah fled from Jerusalem. And he fled from Jerusalem to Joppa. And he got on a boat at Joppa and fled. Not that God could never see him. Jonah said, "I fled from the temple." Because that's where the presence of God is. And that's the closest port to Joppa. When I was out in the sea, I looked toward the temple and looked toward Jerusalem, where God is and the presence of God is. So Jonah's just saying he left Jerusalem. Now, he didn't just leave, of course. Jonah has a little hissy fit, doesn't he? He's grumpy with God. And in his despair and in his anger, he leaves the temple for a boat that would take him to Tarshish. I don't know if Jonah knew of any places further from Jerusalem than Tarshish. Perhaps in Jonah's mind it was the furthest place he could get from the presence of God. Tarshish, west of Israel, of course, is opposite in direction from Nineveh. God says go north and east. Jonah says, no thanks, I'll go west, as far as I can. But let's get his motivations right. Did Jonah think he could disobey God and get away with it? Well, no, I don't think Jonah thought that. Did God think that God wouldn't see him? Clearly not. Jonah knew that. This was exactly the God that Jonah wanted, wasn't it? Jonah wanted the God that would execute judgment on the unfaithful. That's what Jonah wanted. That's the God that Jonah was after. Did Jonah think he could flee and get away with it? Well, absolutely not, because he wanted a God that would absolutely punish that kind of behaviour. What Jonah was doing was hoping. In 1 Kings 17 verse 1, we're told of Elijah the prophet. Don't turn it up, you'll know this. And I'm going to suggest now that Elijah's an inspiration for Jonah. He's a mentor figure, if you like, for Jonah. A hero even for Jonah. The Jews would argue that Elijah is Jonah's father, because it was a young boy that Elijah came to know. Now, I don't believe that, by the way, because there's about 150 years between Elijah and Jonah. But it's a good story for the Jews. And the Jews make the point that they are cut from the same cloth. And they really are, in more ways than one. And in 1 Kings 17 verse 1, Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said unto Ahab, "As Yahweh Elohim of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, that's my God, and I stand before him." And prophets stood before God. That was their job. That was Jonah's job. And for Jonah, the word would come in the temple. And he would flee the temple and abandon his post. What Jonah did was quit, wasn't he? He walked off the job. I'm not doing it. And he threw down his mantle, if you like, and he stalked out of the temple and he left and abandoned his position. I'm not prepared to stand before God and be that prophet. And he paid the fare, went down into the boat. Fare, by the way, means price or wage. Which is interesting, of course, because what's Jonah really buying with this fare? Well, Jonah's probably buying the wages of sin, isn't he? Because we know in Romans 6 verse 23 that the wages of sin is death. And Jonah knows that also. He doesn't know the book of Romans because it wasn't written then, but Jonah wants the God that will punish disobedience. And for Jonah, that was absolutely on the cards. And though he was defiant, what's he really doing? Well, Jonah's prepared to die for his people, isn't he? Jonah's point, of course, is simple. If I go to Nineveh and they repent, and you don't destroy them, well, they'll come and destroy my people. And they would. So what Jonah's saying is, I would rather die than protect Nineveh. Because if I die, my people might live. So his motivations, although perhaps askew, are sincere. Now, in this country, if God said to one of us, arise and go to Nineveh, we might say, oh yeah, nah. Because we're a little bit, I guess, perhaps not as passionate as the Mediterraneans. And we're a little bit low-key by comparison. And it might be hard to imagine somebody who would say, I would rather die, and actually be prepared to die. So ask yourself that question, if you do that for your brethren. Would you actually do it? Well, we can talk about it. Jonah's quite prepared to die. Jonah 1 verse 4. Yahweh sends out a great wind, a mighty tempest in the sea, so the ship was like to be broken. Now, if you think about it, if you're a Hebrew, be right. So the Hebrews weren't seafarers. In time to come, they would sail on the Sea of Galilee. But they'd really failed. If you think about where the Philistines lived, well, they lived on the coast. And the Jews really had failed to colonise the western strip of the land. So there's kind of a 10 to 20 mile border running right down the Mediterranean that they hadn't really taken. That was kind of a no man's land for them, but it became over time a physical barrier between them and the shores of the Mediterranean. So they were essentially landlocked. Now, where could Jonah have gone? Well, he could have fled south, couldn't he? He could have gone to Egypt and hidden in North Africa somewhere. He could have gone north and then faked to go east and gone west instead and run around into Greece. Why get a boat? Why there? Jonah had other choices. Well, if you're a Hebrew, the sea isn't somewhere you'd go. It's an unfamiliar place for a Hebrew to go. It's quite a desperate thing for Jonah to do. For the Hebrews, many of them, in fact, for most of the Near East, it was a tempestuous place, under a divine hand of some kind, uncontrollable, unpredictable, and not somewhere you'd go willingly, particularly if you're a Hebrew. It was chaotic, the sea, a deep, dark force you couldn't control. So Jonah launches onto the sea, and soon after, and with blinding fury, a mighty tempest arose. Now, I've got a little article about the storm. This is the same storm that Paul would encounter in centuries later. A mighty tempest arises. Now, this is the first of many great mighty things. There are lots of extreme things in the book of Jonah. The margin tells us that God cast it forth. It's the same word used in 1 Samuel 18 verse 33 and 1 Samuel 20 verse 11. In both those occasions, in 1 Samuel 18 verse 33 and 1 Samuel 20 verse 11, it's when Saul takes his javelin and he casts it, throwing it that he might kill somebody. So when God, if you like, in Jerusalem, at the temple as it were, sees the prophet flee, you can imagine God picking up the storm and he hurls it after Jonah and it unrolls across the Mediterranean and they come quickly. It's a brutal storm, an east wind of judgment. And so the sailors, of course, knowing what the wind would do was crucial. And these men were good sailors. Make a note in your margin of Psalm 107 from verse 23 to 27. This tells you of this kind of storm. It tells you that they that go down to the sea in ships that do business in the waters, they see the works of Yahweh, his wonders in the deep, because he commands and raises the stormy wind which lifts up the waves. The waves mount up to heaven, they go down to the depths, their soul is melted because of trouble, they reel to and fro and stagger like a drunken man, and that's what the waves are like in a storm like this. Entirely uncontrollable. Well, that's the God that Jonah wants, isn't it? A God that would hurl storms across the ocean. A God that would send fire from heaven. A God that would bring earthquakes. That's the God that Jonah was after with Nineveh. Or is that a God who would hurl a storm because of mercy? Because he wants to correct Jonah and to reset his path. And for Jonah to understand and to learn a lesson, rather than Jonah to be punished. And then there, of course, is the thinking of man and the thinking of God. But it was a fierce storm. At the end of chapter 4, end of verse 4, it means, when it says the ship was like to be broken, it means the ship herself was afraid she would break apart under the force. And so in verse 5, Jonah 1, the mariners were afraid, and they cried, and they cast forth the wares, but Jonah, of all things, is fast asleep in the sides of the ship. Now just imagine how that could happen. How could you sleep through that, really? If you've ever sailed on a sailing boat with ropes and sails, they're really noisy. And then in the middle of a howling storm, how could you sleep? Well, verse 5 is an extraordinary contrast. The word mariner comes from a root meaning to salt, which is where we get our expression old salt from, for a sailor. Here it literally means those who follow the salt. Well, the mariners, expert sailors though they were, are still terrified of the storm. And they cry, everyone to their God, and Jonah sleeps. By all of them crying to their gods, you would imagine that there are a multitude of nationalities there. A multitude of gods, clearly. Where they all came from, we're not sure. Which gods they were, we can probably guess. Most of them, many of them probably were Phoenicians. Phoenicians were the expert sailors of the time. They were the great traders. They ran the merchant ships across the Mediterranean, so most of them probably Phoenician. Therefore, they were Baal worshippers of one kind or another. So the storm, therefore, was a test for their sailing ability and a test for their gods. Could their gods deliver them from the storm? Well, they throw their cargo overboard, that they might lighten the ship. It's the same idea you see in Acts 27, verse 18, when they wrote, being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lightened the ship, in Acts 27, verse 18, which makes sense, of course, that you would lighten your load. But it also makes the journey pointless now, because you've thrown your cargo overboard, so you can't now trade it, because you've got nothing to sell. Why continue? Why not just turn around and go back to Joppa? Reload, and then sail again. Well, that would be awkward for Jonah, wouldn't it, if the ship did that? Because that's exactly where Jonah had fled from. But the word lightened in verse 5 is usually translated differently. It doesn't usually mean just to make things light. It can be translated as swift or easy or abated, but not usually. Usually it means despised, reviled, vile, evil, or most commonly, cursed. So it's used in only one other place, as it's used here in Jonah. And that's in 1 Samuel 6, verse 5. Let's just turn that up. Begin at verse 4 for context. 1 Samuel 6. 1 Samuel 6 verse 4. Then said they, this is the story of Samuel and the Philistines, then said they in verse 4, what shall a trespass offering be which we shall return to him? They said, 5 golden emerods, 5 golden mice, according to the number of the lords of the Philistines. For 1 plague was on your wall and 1 on your lords. Wherefore ye shall make images of your emerods, images of your mice that mar the land, and ye shall give glory unto God of Israel. And here's the clue. Peradventure he will lighten his hand from off you, and from off your gods, and from off your land. What this is telling us about the mariners, brothers and sisters, they weren't just making the ship lighter that the ship might float better on the water. They are throwing their things overboard to appease a God who might lighten his hand from them. They are sacrificing their stuff to the sea. There's a material benefit because they can sail the boat. But they are not just throwing stuff overboard, they are appeasing gods by throwing their things. Because if they sacrifice to the god, whichever god it is, and it could be a number, well, the god might spare the ship and the god might spare their lives. Because they've all just been crying to their gods. And Jonah sleeps. Through it all, Jonah sleeps. Probably he's tired. Probably he's emotionally spent. He's had a hard day. It wasn't a decision Jonah came to lightly, I don't think. Jonah understands what the end of this decision could be. The same Hebrew word for sleep here talks about Sisera's deep sleep in Judges chapter 4. It talks about the deep sleep that God will put Adam under and Abram under. It's that kind of deep sleep. But here's a brother, if you like, who's turned his back on God, walked away from the truth, turned his face from the things of the word, and hid in a boat, like he's buried his head in the sand, not prepared to look, because he didn't want to do the job. Well, we'll all have ships, won't we? We'll all have places to go to avoid doing the job, whatever the job is. I don't want to do welfare, so I'll busy myself in other things. I don't want to talk to brother X or sister Y, so I'll busy myself in other things. I haven't got time for that because I'm busy doing other stuff. So we'll all have ships that we hide in to avoid a job we don't like. And we'll all have commissions to go to Nineveh or jobs we don't like. And we'll all find ways of hiding from the job. I'm too busy at work, too busy with the kids, too busy doing something else, which are all just ways of saying, I don't want to do the job. Perhaps Jonah was divinely assisted to sleep. Because perhaps it would make the lesson stand out in a starker relief. Because then there's this most remarkable conversation with the shipmaster, who comes in verse 6. And you've got to imagine this pagan shipmaster looking at the man who's sleeping. Is that indifference? Is that carelessness? Is that a disregard for his fellow man? We're up here trying to save the ship, in the middle of a storm, and you sleep? What's all that about? Why don't you help? That would be useful. We've all prayed to our gods and sacrificed to our gods. You could do that. Well, the shipmaster comes in verse 6. What meanest thou, O sleeper? Arise, call upon thy God, if so be that God will think upon us that we perish not. It's a lovely expression, really. It means the captain of the ropes, shipmaster. And he comes to remind Jonah of Jonah's duty. Yahweh said to Jonah, arise and cry. The shipmaster says, arise, call, but it's the same words. So Jonah's already been told by the shipmaster, arise and cry for the Gentiles on the boat. And Jonah's already said, I don't want to arise and cry to the Gentiles in Nineveh. And Jonah says exactly the same to the shipmaster. He asks him personally to get up and help. Well, that of course is precisely what Jonah wanted to avoid. That's why he's in the belly of the ship in the first place. But who was this passenger really? Why would the shipmaster make the effort to go down to Jonah? We're not told. The shipmaster went down to the hold and banged on the doors of all the passengers and said, quick, come up top, we could use the help. He asked Jonah. Why are you sleeping? Why aren't you praying? Why aren't you helping? Why aren't you doing something? What passenger gets a personal visit from the captain? Why aren't we told about other passengers? Why was there a crew and a captain and seemingly only one passenger? If you come back to verse 3, just have a little look. On arriving at Joppa, Jonah goes down to Joppa. Verse 3, Jonah rose up to flee into Tarshish from the presence of Yahweh and went down to Joppa. And he found a ship going to Tarshish, so he paid the fare thereof and went down into it, and off they go. He arrives, he finds a ship, pays the fare, and goes into the ship. And this was not a random visit. This was not a hasty run out of the temple, flee Jerusalem, go to Joppa. I mean, it's like any one of us running off to the airport and saying, book me the next flight out of here. It's not that. Jonah didn't do that. There's a lot more to Jonah going to Joppa than just that. Here's why. If you did classics back in school, here's a wee refresher. Charon was one of the figures in the Greek underworld who would ferry you across the Styx River. And you'd pay him an obol. And he would then take you from the one side of the Styx across to Hades in the underworld. That's how you got there. And you had to pay the ferryman, which is where we get the expression from. And he would then take you across the river and you could go into the Greek underworld. And the Greeks would put an obol, which is a coin, in the mouth of the dead, so they had money to pay the ferryman when he got to the river Styx. It's just like mum and dad putting money in your pocket when you catch the train. Same thing, right? So you can pay your fare. Except that the idea of paying for a fare didn't come for about 500 years after Jonah. You couldn't buy a ticket when Jonah was around. That whole concept came much, much later. In fact, it wasn't really a fare for passage. It didn't really arrive until the Romans brought it in. The Greeks kind of started the concept of paying for a trip, but the idea of a paid passage wasn't anything until it was the Romans. What that means, and the implication for Jonah, is that Jonah didn't buy a ticket to go to Tarshish. Jonah chartered the boat to go to Tarshish. He is the only passenger on the boat because it's Jonah's boat. He doesn't own it, of course, but he's found a boat and he's rented the whole boat. Where's it going? Tarshish. I'll rent that one. So there's more to Jonah's plan than a hasty retreat from Jerusalem. He's decided what he's going to do. He's planned how this will happen. And he's afforded a cabin in the hold and the luxury of being the only passenger. Consequently, when the sailors are in trouble, they go to the passenger. But note verse 1 to 3 of Jonah chapter 1. The problem for Jonah, of course, is he lacks compassion. He doesn't want to save the Ninevites. Well, from verse 4 to 6, it's the same Jonah. He doesn't want to save the sailors either. And it just further reinforces the separation between the compassion of God and the lack of compassion that Jonah has. Because Jonah's not only running in an opposite direction from what God wants, he's displaying an opposite character to what God wants. He's got little compassion for Nineveh and little compassion for the sailors. And think about what the captain does. The captain's just saying, Jonah, do your job. Arise and cry as a prophet, Jonah. And he exhorts him to seek his God. He exhorts Jonah to get up and to pray to his God that they all might be spared. And he rebukes the prophet of Yahweh for his unrighteousness, a pagan sailor. How galling would that be? Would that prick your conscience? You're at the supermarket and you cut in line and someone else says, I thought you were a Christadelphian. That's not very polite. You cheat on your taxes, you do something wrong, and your neighbour, ungodly, pulls you up for your conduct. I didn't think you'd do that because you're a Christadelphian. That would be awkward, wouldn't it? Well, that's what it's like for Jonah. It's what the captain does. Verse 7, Jonah still refuses. Now, is that pride where he refuses, or is that courage to continue his course and execute his plan to save his own people? Jonah would say it's courage. God would say it's pride. And in there is all the messiness of human justification, isn't it? That we all do all the time. Jonah's thought through this. This is not random and hasty and unplanned. He's made a decision, he's planned, he's got a reason, he's got a whole argument for all of this. Because he's arguing still in the end of chapter 4. Jonah knows what he's doing. And so in verse 7, and we'll conclude here, they cast lots. So we know whose fault this is. So they cast lots and it falls upon Jonah. Well, they're determined to root out this evil, aren't they, the soldiers? To find out what's gone on. Well, for them, slide I missed, there's the paying the ferryman taking the obol out of the mouth of the dead. If you think about what the sailor's going to do with Jonah, remember what it was like for Achan back in the book of Joshua. Whose fault is this? Tribe, family, you. When you go from 12 tribes to 1, 11 tribes go, whew. Then you cut out a whole bunch of families, and Achan knew, didn't he? And Jonah knew. Back in Exodus 28, verse 30, God had appointed a way for the priest to find out God's will and to take stones. They might have looked something like this. In the breastplate of judgment, they would have these stones. In Exodus 28, verse 30, which essentially gave them a yes-no answer to a question. That was the only divination permitted by God. So what kind of lots they cast here, we don't know. It's a bit hard in the wind and the rain to cast animal entrails or this kind of thing here, which looks pretty neat. It's a bit hard to do that on the ship of a deck, which is heaving to and fro like a drunken man. Might look something like that today. In modern parlance, you might say, we're just going to draw straws. And in the howling wind, the pouring rain, these men, terrified for their lives, having cried to their gods to no avail, begged this man to pray to his God, and he's steadfastly refused to do a single thing for them. We've got no other option. One of you has done this. Let's find out who it is. So they draw straws. Proverbs 16 verse 33 tells us this. The lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof is of Yahweh. And they drew straws, and Jonah won. Or lost. And verse 8, we'll talk about tomorrow.